What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL playoffs, divisional round, Sunday games, final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL playoffs. Let's take a look at this 2-game Sunday slate for this divisional playoffs. Sunday 2-game slate, already said that. Let's go. At the quarterback position, I like Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Josh Allen has averaged 27 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.8 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 41% owned, projected at 25.7 fantasy points here on Sunday. He's 7,800 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Bills favored by 6. So Josh Allen has scored 28, 23, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 4, 9, and 6 rush attempts in those games. So consistently scoring over 20 fantasy points. I like his rushing upside. So I like Josh Allen here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. The other quarterback that I like, and I think he's a little underpriced, is Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing quarterbacks, and Dak Prescott has averaged 18.1 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 3.8 rush attempts per game. He's only going to be about 17% owned, which it looks like he might be the lowest owned quarterback on the slate, at least by these projections. I don't believe that's going to be the case, but if that is the case, I like this play even more. He's projected at 20.2 fantasy points here on Sunday, only 6,100 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game. They have the Cowboys trailing by 4. Dak Prescott scored 40, 10, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 7, 6, and 3 rush attempts in those games. So I like Dak Prescott here for 6,100 because you got Brock Purdy at 5,400 and Joe Burrow at 6,500. And no quarterback really has a good matchup here. Everyone's playing a tough defense. So I like Dak Prescott here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So, stud on the slate, and by far the best running back on the slate, not even close. I like Christian McCaffrey from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing running backs. Christian McCaffrey has averaged 21.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.4 rush attempts per game and 6.4 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 75% of the snaps, going to be about 58% owned, projected at 25.2 fantasy points here on Sunday. Now, he's only 8,000 DraftKings salary. He could easily be priced 9,000 or more, so I like that DraftKings price. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 4. Now, I actually think the Cowboys could win this game, but Christian McCaffrey, he should get a huge workload here today. He scored 25, 17, and 34 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 15, 10, and 19 rush attempts on top of 2, 3, and 9 pass targets. So despite both these teams having good defenses, I actually think it's going to be a pretty high scoring game here. I think both teams are going to be able to move the ball. Both of them have good offenses. They'll both be putting on pressure on the other team to score. And I got a feeling that Christian McCaffrey is going to get like 20 to 25 plus touches in this game. Really, he hasn't got more than 20 touches for the past 2 games. Only 17 and 13 touches. So I'm expecting a pretty heavy workload here for Christian McCaffrey. So I like Christian McCaffrey here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Now, the other running back I like didn't have a good week last week, but he's set up for a good bounce back game here tonight. I like Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Buffalo Bills, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing running backs. Joe Mixon has averaged 17.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15 rush attempts per game and 5.4 pass targets per game. Gonna be about 43% owned, projected at 19 fantasy points here tonight. He's 6,500 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's gonna be 49 points scored in this game, with the Bengals trailing by 6. So Joe Mixon has scored 9, 18, and 18 fantasy points in his last 3 games. He got 11, 11, and 16 rush attempts in those games, on top of 4, 5, and 9 pass targets. So I like Joe Mixon here versus the Buffalo Bills.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
And the other running backs that you can consider here, Tony Pollard, 6,100. I would much rather play Joe Mixon for 6,500. And then Ezekiel Elliott for 5,400. And you got Elijah Mitchell at 4,700 with Devin Singletary at 5,200. But I really think I'm going to play a mix of Christian McCaffrey and Joe Mixon. I think those are going to be my 2 running backs on the slate here tonight. So let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So studs on the slate, you got Jamar Chase, Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb. Now finally we're getting some good matchups here. Jamar Chase from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Buffalo Bills, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Jamar Chase has averaged 21.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.2 pass targets per game. Been on the field for 70% of the snaps, gonna be about 44% owned, projected at 23.8 fantasy points here on Sunday. He's 7,800 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Bengals trailing by 6. And Jamar Chase has scored 23, 23, and 15 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 12, 13, and 11 pass targets in those games. So probably my favorite wide receiver on the slate. So I like Jamar Chase here versus the Buffalo Bills. Then another stud on the slate, you got Stephon Diggs from the Buffalo Bills. Now the Bengals have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing wide receivers. Stephon Diggs has averaged 21.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.6 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 77% of the snaps, going to be about 42% owned, projected at 20.5 fantasy points here tonight. He's 7,700 DraftKings salary, 500 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Bills favored by 6. Stephon Diggs has scored 21 and 26 fantasy points in the last 2 games, off of 9 and 10 pass targets. So I like Stephon Diggs here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, stud on the slate for the Dallas Cowboys is CeeDee Lamb, and the San Francisco 49ers have a good defense overall, but they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. CeeDee Lamb has averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.2 pass targets per game. Been on the field for 87% of the snaps, going to be about 32% owned, projected at 18.9 fantasy points here tonight. He's 7,300 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys trailing by 4. So not a lot of volume the past 2 games, but he's still been pretty productive. CeeDee Lamb has scored 17, 16, and 24 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 6, 7, and 14 pass targets. So with a favorable matchup here, I do expect CeeDee Lamb to get close to 10 pass targets here tonight. I think he's going to go over 20 fantasy points. Good matchup, and a game that San Francisco is going to put the pressure on Dallas to throw the ball. So I like CeeDee Lamb here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, now for the 49ers, you got a couple wide receivers here that have a pretty low salary. So I'm going to mix one of these guys in along with one of those studs. So I like Deebo Samuel from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So you can see the Cowboys and the 49ers not very good versus wide receivers. So that's why I think they're going to put up a lot of points here today. I think they're going to be throwing the ball quite a bit, trying to attack the weakness in the defense. And Deebo Samuel has averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.2 pass targets per game and 3.2 rush attempts per game. So averaging over 10 touches a game with those rush attempts. He's going to be about 36% owned, projected at 14.4 fantasy points here tonight. Only 5,900 DraftKings salary, and he scored 32 fantasy points last week off of 9 pass targets. So I like Deebo Samuel here versus the Dallas Cowboys. And now, probably one of my favorite value plays on the slate is Brandon Ayuk from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 3rd worst defense defending opposing wide receivers. Brandon Ayuk has averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 92% of the snaps. That leads all wide receivers on the slate, and he's projected to be about 26% owned, projected at 13.3 fantasy points here tonight. I think he's going to score 15 fantasy points or more. He's 5,000 DraftKings salary, and Brandon Ayuk has scored 10, 10, and 30 fantasy points in the last 3 games, up of 5, 5, and 12 pass targets. So I like Brandon Ayuk here versus the Dallas Cowboys.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, Just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
So if you're looking for some other value plays at the wide receiver position, Brandon Ayuk, probably my favorite. But then for the Buffalo Bills, you got Gabe Davis, who put up 26 fantasy points last game off of 9 pass targets, sitting at 4,800 DraftKings salary. And then you have Tyler Boyd, averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.1 pass targets per game. He's way down at only 4,000 DraftKings salary. Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals got a good matchup here versus the Buffalo Bills, who give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Tyler Boyd only scored 6, 10, and 5 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 3, 7, and 4 pass targets. But at that 4,000 DraftKings salary, I think that makes him an attractive value play. A guy that should get a handful of pass targets. If he finds the end zone, he'll certainly hit value. So I like Tyler Boyd here versus the Buffalo Bills. And I was surprised to see this. Take a look at T. Higgins from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Buffalo Bills, who have the 8th worst defense overall. They have a good defense overall, give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. T. Higgins has averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. Going to be about 35% owned, and I think he's going to have to be my favorite value play on the slate. Only 5,800 DraftKings salary, averaging more fantasy points than Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Gabe Davis, Tyler Boyd, averaging more fantasy points per game than all the other value plays at the wide receiver position. He could easily be over 6K here at only 5,800 DraftKings salary, projected at 13.4 fantasy points here tonight. I think he has a big game, and he scored 10, 2, and 30 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 7, and 9 pass targets. So I like T. Higgins here versus the Buffalo Bills. And one more value play you got to consider here, Michael Gallup from the Dallas Cowboys. 49ers give up the 5th most fantasy points defending opposing wide receivers. Michael Gallup scored 16 fantasy points last game off of 6 pass targets. Going to be about 20% owned. Now, I think I prefer Tyler Boyd a little bit more here over Michael Gallup. But if you're looking at the $4,000 range, 3,800 to 4,000, I would go with Michael Gallup or Tyler Boyd. So I like Michael Gallup here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I like Dalton Schultz, who had a monster game last week, and he's from the Dallas Cowboys playing the San Francisco 49ers, who have a good defense overall, been good versus opposing tight ends. Dalton Schultz has averaged 9.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.9 pass targets per game. Going to be about 39% owned, projected at 14.9 fantasy points here tonight. That projection might be a little bit high coming off of that 29 fantasy point game. I mean, he's only averaging 9.6 fantasy points per game on the season, so I can see him scoring something around 10, 12 fantasy points. I think that's more reasonable expectation. But he's only 4,200 DraftKings salary, and we know he's got 20 plus fantasy point upside. Dalton Schultz has scored 29, 7, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 9, and 10 pass targets. So I like Dalton Schultz here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Now, I don't know how I feel about George Kittle here. He's 5,700 DraftKings salary. And for that amount of money, you could play Deebo Samuel or you could play Brandon Ayuk. But George Kittle has had some pretty good big games with Brock Purdy, although only 2 pass targets last game for 8 fantasy points. So that's going to drop his ownership quite a bit. But I do think he's still an interesting play here. George Kittle
has averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.7 pass targets per game. Been on the field for 79% of the snaps, going to be about 26% owned, and he's projected at 12.3 fantasy points here on Sunday. George Kittle has scored 8, 19, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 2, 6, and 8 pass targets. Now, I do expect a little more work from George Kittle here today on Sunday because I think the Dallas Cowboys are going to score plenty of points, put the pressure on the 49ers to throw the ball. So I like George Kittle here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Now, if you're looking for a value play, you don't want to go with Dalton Schultz, need to save a little extra salary, you can take a look at Dawson Knox or Hayden Hurst. Dawson Knox from the Buffalo Bills. He's 3,800 DraftKings salary. He's averaging 9.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 38% owned, projected at 9.2 fantasy points here tonight. Only 3,800 DraftKings salary. Now, I think I'd prefer to pay up 400 for Dalton Schultz, but if the lineup already has a bunch of Dallas Cowboys in it, you want to go with Dawson Knox. I think it's a pretty good play here. So he scored 11, 9, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 5, 2, and 5 pass targets. So I like Dawson Knox here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, now here's a super value play. I'd call him a sleeper pick, but his ownership is going to be pretty high here. But I'll still call him a sleeper pick. I think this guy's going to go under the radar. Take a look at Hayden Hurst from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Buffalo Bills. Hayden Hurst has averaged 8.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.2 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 32% owned, projected at 8.5 fantasy points here on Sunday. Only 3,200 DraftKings salary. Hayden Hurst scored 8 and 5 fantasy points in his last 2 games, off of 6 and 5 pass targets. So I like Hayden Hurst as a low salary option here versus the Buffalo Bills.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.